Hello, and welcome to this educational segment on managing horses following flooding events and in wet environmental conditions. We will discuss today some important considerations for horse safety and health when we are dealing with managing horses after severe natural disasters that bring a lot of flooding and a lot of heavy rain to our areas. So I'm joined today by Dr. Neely Walker. Dr. Walker is the State Extension Equine Specialist with the LSU Ag Center, and she's here to discuss this important topic and to provide some helpful tips and information for our horse owners and equine facilities. Welcome, Dr. Walker.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's very good to have you here. So I think to start us off, just have a few questions that we'll go through today to discuss this really good topic. But just to start off, I think we can all appreciate several of us in our various locations around the country have definitely experienced multiple tropical storm systems, hurricanes, and this heavy or frequent rain event kind of situation, not just this year, but in previous years, and certainly this looks like it will be a continuing trend into the future. So this definitely presents some significant challenges for us as horse owners and equine facility managers. So to begin, my first question for you, Neely, is in the aftermath of a flood, what are some of the most immediate horse safety and health concerns that we need to address?
Absolutely. So first off, right away, if you look at our background slide here, the first thing I can think of is if you are in a wet environment, you've had a hurricane aftermath, you've got flooding, or you've got significant flooding, or even just mild flooding on your property. The first thing you need to do is absolutely get your horses to higher or dry ground, whether that's in a stall or just allowing them to have access to something drier than what they're in. Absolutely, the worst case scenario is leaving them in standing water. Horses are unlike other livestock. Their skin barrier, that external layer that protects their organs and their the physiological processes that they have to go through every day, is much thinner and is way more susceptible to things like cellulitis and skin sloughing than other livestock species. So standing, we've seen researches and different experiences where horses were standing in water for as little as 2 hours and their skin started to slough. So really important to get horses off of any wet pastures. Obviously, if it's a hurricane and there are high winds and things like that, you need to clear your pastures of debris. Especially if you're standing in water, you have to be really careful about moving animals from one location to another because you don't know what kind of damage is lying underneath the water. And that water is usually pretty murky and kind of silty, so it's kind of hard to see what's at the bottom. So you don't know if you're walking through a ditch and that ditch is full of barbed wire or any other implements that were left out on your pasture or got blown into your pasture. The other thing that I found out that was pretty unique from firsthand experience moving horses through some waist deep water, there are floating rafts of fire ants that are a pain in the hiney, literally. Also snakes and spiders and other types of biting and stinging insects are going to be floating on top of the water. And if you're not careful, they can end up in your boots, they can end up in your clothes, because they're all trying to survive too. So you got to be careful about moving those. And while those are hazards for us, they can also be hazards for our horses. And other than that, you just want to look out for the general safety and allowing your pastures and things to recover appropriately. So, you don't want your horses to stand or your livestock to stand on saturated pasture. You want to get them to a drier location.
So excellent, thank you. And I know one of the questions we are frequently asked as part of the aftermath and the recovery process, returning horses to the pasture, particularly if they're relying on pasture for part of their nutrition. There's always some questions and concerns about, how safe is that pasture grass once the water's receded? When can we expect to put those horses back out there, and what else should we be looking for?
Right. So that's going to be, and I'm not a pasture soil scientist, but we always recommend, in working with some of our faculty members here at the Ag Center, we've done some looking through some of these options. And all of that's going to really depend upon the type of soil type you have and the type of grazing systems that you have put in place and the type of grass you have. Fortunately, in our areas in Florida and in Louisiana, we have some really great pasture forages. So things like Bermuda and Bahia are really flood tolerant and or moisture, wet saturated tolerant. Bahia can last up to 84 days submerged, and Bermuda can last up to 55 days submerged. So we're not really too concerned with you losing the pasture if it's established. The problem that you may have, depending upon your soil type, is how quickly that water is going to run off. And it may cause erosion. If you don't have any trouble with erosion, the more dense your soil is, the longer it's going to take for that pasture to completely recover and to not hold as much water. The things that we ran into in 2016 when we had that big flood in August, a lot of the areas around us have plants or hazardous waste production or oil production, oil refineries. And a lot of our pastures and a lot of our extension people were really concerned about having hazardous waste and hazardous materials or chemicals on their pasture and what that would do. Fortunately, with the high content of water that we had, we found out very quickly that most of the toxic chemicals and things like that were very diluted. So the pasture didn't actually have time to absorb anything that would be hazardous to your horses. However, if you are concerned, one of the other major things that happens in flood situations is there's going to be a layer of silt left over on your pastures, no matter what you do. It's just going to move through, the water's going to move through. It's going to leave this nasty layer of silt, and that ultimately affects the palatability of your pasture. So what we end up recommending is mowing that pasture when it's dry enough to, right? Mow that pasture, clip that grass down to about 3 inches. Once it returns a little bit to 4 inches, so about 2 weeks, it should be fine to return your horses to that pasture, as long as there's no, you've removed all the physical potential hazards. There's no barbed wire. You've done your fence line cleanup and things like that.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Okay. The next question is a little bit more about, some specific health and or disease conditions that we need to be monitoring our horses for in these wet environments. So can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there is a huge laundry list of things that could potentially happen, right? It goes from everything from lacerations and small abrasions and bruises and punctures and things like that, to things floating under the water, just stepping on something random. Their hooves are extra soft because they've been standing in a wet environment. So that's going to open yourself up to things like abscesses and white line disease and thrush and all those basic things that, horse owners in our environment are pretty used to managing. But then it can go all the way up to neurologic conditions. They can get aspiration pneumonia. They can get clostridial infections. They can get pulmonary edema, skin issues, dermatitis, summer sores, pythium. They can get eye issues from corneal ulcers. They can get uveitis. So there's really a laundry list of things that they can get in these situations. And it's really hard to kind of be prepared for everything. You just kind of have to know what's in your area and be as best prepared as possible. The other thing that we have to be aware of as far as general health concerns is after a flood, obviously we're going to have a ton of external parasites. And those are posing a significant issue here in Louisiana right now after the aftermath of Hurricane Laura. We've actually had swarms of mosquitoes suffocating livestock, including our horses, which I never thought we would, that would be something we would have to worry about. But in the same line with that, if we're having that many swarms of mosquitoes, we're also going to be concerned about any of those mosquito-borne diseases like the encephalitis or West Nile. So you just need to work with your veterinarian and make sure that you have all of your regular maintenance protocols in place. Make sure that your horses are vaccinated, hopefully prior to the heavy storm season. and because it takes some time for horses to build immunity, obviously. But yeah, and just kind of be prepared for potentially anything that can happen. I feel like most horse owners, if you live in the South or you live in the Gulf South, you're pretty used to the common ailments that'll happen. You just need to be aware that, especially horses, and we talked a little bit about the skin issues with them standing in water. A lot of times if horses have to swim long distances to get to safety, or if they have to stand in a confined area, if you don't let them out of a stall, it's really easy for these horses to end up getting aspiration pneumonia. And unfortunately, after they do something like that, it's really hard for them to recover. And then the other issue we have to be concerned about is, of course, laminitis. And in 2016, we had a host of problems and horses that lost literally every ounce of external skin. And we could save them, we could get them back to normal and have them fully recovered as long as their feet didn't fall off. So if we could keep them from getting laminitis, we could usually help them work through everything else. But unfortunately, in 2016, between the pneumonia and the laminitis, I feel like that's the two biggest culprits of the majority of our euthanasias for that event.
So that's a really important point, Neely. With things like aspiration pneumonia, or like some respiratory conditions that they can get if they really are, I mean, again, you mentioned like a horse in this picture that is immersed in water and has to swim a distance to get out of that condition. What are some of maybe the signs or symptoms that you guys saw in recognizing that issue?
Yeah, so right away, they just have trouble breathing, and any of you who've ever managed foals or seen pneumonia, a lot of these horses you could kind of see and hear they were struggling to breathe. Their respiration was increased. They obviously were not oxygenating well. They're kind of lethargic because they're spending all of their energy trying to breathe. And it wasn't horses. They almost kind of looked like a heave horse, but they did not have heaves. And you could hear the lungs. You could hear the extra noises that were going on, the crackling and the popping kind of in their upper airway and in their lungs. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious when a horse, which is an obligate nasal breather, right? It's pretty obvious when they're not oxygenating well. So if you see a horse that's been standing in water and it's having a hard time breathing, it needs to go to a vet right away. Like, don't wait. Don't just say, oh, he's just, struggling or he's just stressed out. He needs to be evaluated sooner rather than later.
Okay. So we did touch a little bit on some of the hoof issues and the skin issues and mosquitoes. So I'd like to come back briefly to a couple of those things. Maybe on the mosquito side, that insect vector that we have to deal with post flooding events, in particular in these wet conditions. What are some other strategies just around the farm, around the barn, that we can try to implement to maybe at least better control that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, like everybody sends out their updates every year for mosquito abatement. Turn over all your water containers. Make sure that there's no standing water on your farm. Sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. Try to make your farm as clean as possible. Pick up anything that may be a breeding ground for the mosquitoes and any other external parasites to the best of your ability, knowing that there are other more important things. If you've lost the roof of your house, obviously, clearing the water out of your pasture is going to be last on your list. But besides that, if you have the option and your barn isn't flooded or ruined, you can bring your horses in to the barn and put them under fans, right? Because mosquitoes are not the best flyers in the world, and they're more active at dusk and dawn. So if you can put them under fans during those time frames, that usually kind of helps alleviate some of that pressure. You can also use fly sprays with permethrins in it, not pyrethrins. You can use permethrin facility spray as well. And in some cases, I know down here, we've had mosquito abatement teams kind of doing crop dusting or using crop dusting planes to spray some of that permethrins onto farms that were affected that couldn't get truck access into. So that was kind of a unique situation. Mm-hmm. You also need to make sure your horses are vaccinated. Fly masks obviously are helpful. yeah, just the generalized, and one of the things that I found really unique is we did have, although I don't necessarily recommend this, we did have some farmers that were having those large swarms of mosquitoes that were suffocating their livestock. They were actually burning or smoking wet round bales out in their pasture to allow those livestock an opportunity to stand in that smoke and kind of help alleviate some of the mosquitoes. So.
Okay, thank you. Back to the skin conditions. I know, pitheosis, you talked about pythium and rain rot and some of these things. Can we just spend a little bit of time maybe talking about some of the treatment and prevention strategies for those conditions?
Sure. So there's really not a prevention strategy for pythium, and I wouldn't wish pythium on my worst enemy. It is, and it can be internal in dogs, and I know that's probably where most of your constituents in Florida are going to recognize this from, because dogs will drink a lot of water when they're in the canalways and stuff like that, and they'll get internal pythiosis. Horses will end up getting it externally due to any type of small wound that are, when they're standing in water, they'll actually absorb some of that bacterium into their skin. And it acts like a fungus, and it's actually a fungus from like lily pads and specific plants in the waterway. But the treatment for that really is they have vaccines available to help kind of boost the immune system. And I had to treat on my farm after 2016. I had 3 horses. They were all aged, and I feel like their immune system was compromised in some way, shape, or form. And they went from small, little, just round dime to quarter size wounds, like a summer sore almost, up to from the knee all the way down to the cornet band. And it was very trying because we would get the pythium kind of taken care of, and then it would turn into a summer sore. And then, because we were in that season where there was lots of external parasites, so I felt like we were battling 2 different wounds all at the same time. And then it became an issue of chronic wound care, and these things become, pythiosis especially becomes very itchy, so the horses start self-mutilating, so they'll start biting and chewing at it, making the granulosa tissue huge and run out of control and rampant. So really between the two, so the strategy that we adopted that ended up working the best, we vaccinated. We worked with the veterinarian out of Texas that kind of created the vaccine for these horses for pythiosis. And we vaccinated all of the horses against the pythiosis on trial. And then we ended up doing wet wraps on all of them, just to keep the external parasites under control and to keep the granulosa tissue under control. And in about 3 months on the one that went from the knee all the way to the cannon bone, it took about 3 months to get that to where the point where we had fresh skin growing in and starting to kind of close properly. The ones that were about the size of a quarter or silver dollar took about 2 to 3 weeks, and we were back in fresh skin and everything was looking good. But when it comes to the summer sore treatment, we would, and I'm not a veterinarian, so if you have, I feel like there's 1,000,001 ways to handle summer sores. But the way that we found on our farm is to take a piece of standing wrap cotton, dip it in a mixture of liquid DMSO and liquid ivermectin, put that over the top of the sore and wrap it. I did not, I had a lot more success not scrubbing the wounds, not using iodine-based cleaners. All of that increases granulosa tissue, and that's what we were ultimately fighting. You had to keep the flies off of it, and you had to keep the tissue from granulosing. So if you could do that and keep the pressure wrap on it, it healed rather quickly. And unfortunately, since I still have all of these retired aged horses with compromised immune systems, I feel like every summer we're treating minimum of 10 to 15 summer sores. Yeah. So that has ended up being our go-to protocol at this point.
Okay. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think the last thing then is maybe just to revisit some of the common hoof ailments or conditions that we see. You mentioned thrush and white line disease. Again, maybe we can't really prevent that when we're in these wet environments, 100% prevention, but we can certainly manage it and treat it as needed. So can we just spend a minute talking about some of those strategies?
Yeah, so honestly, I feel like if you live in Louisiana, you live in Florida, unless you're lucky enough to be in some of those really sandy areas in Florida, you're used to this by now, right? Like, you know that if you have horses, it's going to be wet. Their feet are going to be terrible unless you do some management. And that means going out, picking hooves. If they're not in a stall, or even if they are in a stall, picking their hooves at least once a day at minimum. If you can pick them more than once a day, it's just going to help them. There are some products out there that really can be helpful. And I don't like plugging any one product over another, but I can tell you I have had crazy success, especially after that 2016 flood. Every single one of the horses feed on my farm, and we had 20 horses on farm at that point. Every single one of their soles and their feet were so soft and so tender. They couldn't even come out of the trailer and walk across a brick ground without, that hard surface was really hard for their feet. Their feet were so soft and so tender. So we used a lot of Caratex that summer. And I mean, within 2 weeks, everybody was right as rain. Like, their soles were getting harder. Things were starting to look good. And the product that I liked the most was the one that you could use to help reduce absorption of all of that extra moisture. So they have quite a few products available, but I found the one that you could put on the sole the most helpful. But yeah, just trying to keep their feet dry, getting them off of the pasture, getting them out of standing water, if possible. The trouble with where we're at right now is it looks dry and you can walk on it in your shoes or in your boots, and your boots don't get wet, maybe just from a little bit of the dew from the grass. But a horse is a lot heavier, and their hoof is going to sink further down into the ground, and it's a smaller, more concentrated surface area, and they're much heavier. So I feel like the soles of their feet are always going to be in some type of moisture here. And it's not impossible to keep good feet, but it does take some management. It does take some time. And you just have to be diligent about it. And if you see a problem, you have to treat it and not let it get out of hand.
So the last one that I have to come back to, because I know we all deal with this, and not just, big flooding events or big natural disasters, but when we just get a few weeks in a row of not even heavy rain, just frequent light rain, high humidity, our horses' skin just generally, we kind of call it the summer funk or the creepy crud, but they just get gross. Their skin gets really irritated. We see rain rot, we just see sloughing of hair coat and things like that. So what are some things that we can do for that to keep on top of that?
Yeah, so what a lot of people don't realize is that rain rot is not necessarily a fungus, right? It's a bacterium that acts like a fungus. So you don't have to go out and purchase all these antifungals that are really expensive to bathe your horse and to scrub all this stuff off. And honestly, it's caused by excess moisture in their skin and standing water on their skin. So the worst thing you really can do is to put more water on them by bathing them and scrubbing them, right? So there's a couple of things that we can do. And again, I don't really like plugging one item over the other, but there are some diaper rash creams that are fairly successful, right? You want to look for an antibacterial. At the same time, you want to find something that's a little soothing, because those sores can get kind of painful depending upon where they're at and how big they are and how thin-skinned your horse is. But then I've had crazy success with, I can get, and I hesitate to say this, but I'll tell you guys anyways. I'll use antimicrobial spray. And what is that? Listerine. Okay, the brown Listerine, I cut it half and half with water on only very mild cases. I use that primarily you'll just spray their coat and it'll dry instantly. If it is very tender and very sore, I don't recommend it, because it'll cause some irritation and can irritate your horse's skin, especially if they're super sensitive already. But I love using the Listerine. I'll use Listerine straight for sanitizing all of the equipment that's been used on the horses. So I'll spray their brushes, I'll spray the saddle pads, I'll spray any of the equipment that's come in contact with, any of the infected area. and it seems to not spread that way. That's the one thing that most people don't think about when they've got rain rot on the property. You know, they'll go brush their horse and throw the brush back in the bucket, and then they spread it to the next horse that uses the same brush. So you got to be diligent about cleaning your stuff. And then when it comes to rain rot, preventing it, you just got to groom your horse. Go spend a little bit of time making sure that they're on all 4 feet, right? When you throw feed in the evening, even if you just use your hand to brush some of the dust off of them, you know, that goes a long way to kind of helping them keep that summer coat or the oils and things moving on their coat like it's supposed to. And they'll help clean their own skin that way.
Yeah, and I think that frequent checking and grooming, especially because then when you do find small patches of areas that are irritated, the sooner you're on those and treating those and addressing those, it tends not to spread as much. And then, like you said, just making sure you're disinfecting your tack and your equipment, and especially your grooming utensils.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, very good. Okay, excellent. I think the last thing that we just wanted to touch on for our viewers today is, you know, we've covered a lot of topics. We didn't really have time to go super in depth on some of these things today, but we have some excellent resources out there through our extension system in terms of our equine programs. So what I'd like to do is let Dr. Walker show us a few of the resources that they have developed and put together for horse owners at the LSU Ag Center.
I'd love to. Give me 1 second. I'm going to continue sharing my screen, but I'm going to end this part. So if anyone is interested, can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay. If anyone is interested in finding out more information about some of our equine topics, you can go to lsuagcenter.com.
So Neely, we still see the slideshow. So
okay, let me see. Hold on 1 second. Let me get to where I'm going and I'll show you.
Okay.
You can go to the LSU Ag Center website and you're going to go to Extension Publications. Let me get here. How's that?
There we go. Yeah. Perfect.
You're going to go to the LSU Ag Center website. You're going to go to Publications. You're going to go to Livestock. And then once you go to Livestock, you can come down here to Horses. And we have plenty of infographics if you like a pictorial view on insect bite hypersensitivity, rain rot, external parasite control, sheltering in place with horses during disasters. We've got stuff on pitheosis. We've got stuff on neurologic disorders and horses post-flood, flood injuries, and the list goes on and on. So if you need any additional information on any of these topics, please feel free to look here. And if you can't find something you're looking for, reach out to one of us and we'll make sure that you can get the information you're looking for.
Fantastic. Those are definitely excellent fact sheets and infographics, Neely. I know also, you know, we certainly encourage you all as you're, you know, wherever you are located within our Southeast states, we have extension specialists on campus or at our education and research centers throughout our states. But certainly one of your best and closest local resources is your parish or your county agent. So we have several ag and natural resource or livestock agents, many of whom are very interested in horses and have some excellent horse background and expertise. So local extension offices are a great place to start when you have questions or need some assistance. So excellent. I think that is all the time we have today for this segment, but I'd like to thank Dr. Walker again for being with us and for providing all of this excellent, very helpful information.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.